America, my name is Osei-Frimpong, and you're watching the coronavirus pandemic being played out live in your world. So you might be watching this at home, socially distancing yourself from people, maybe not at work, and this causes political problems and political struggles, the likes of which we haven't seen or met very well yet. The good news is I have brought you a real live U.S. Senate candidate. I've moved my studio to my home. We're going to do this. We're going to walk through together how to make sense of this pandemic in your life. And we're going to do it publicly, isolated in our hermetically sealed booths. And to lay out the stakes of what's going on for our life and kind of the struggles you might be feeling inside, I'm going to let Richard Dean Winfield, candidate for U.S. Senate, kind of talk you through what this means for our life as citizens. All right, so hold on. And go ahead. Richard, hit it.
Okay, the coronavirus is presenting a mammoth challenge to the people of the United States and the people of virtually every country in the world. It's a challenge to keep our health and minimize the illnesses and deaths that the pandemic is threatening. It's at the same time a challenge to minimize the disruptions of our family lives, our lives in society, and our political lives. And it is not just a matter of providing remedies that will return us to the status quo. It's also a summons to engage in transformative measures that are needed simply to contain the developing pandemic, because our failure to have taken various measures has left us particularly vulnerable, and we are now, in a way, entering a perfect storm where we are faced with the necessity of making some very important policy changes that should be regarded not just as emergency measures, but matters that should become part of the permanent fabric of a free society and a free nation.
So about that, I have worries about emergency measures in general, because sometimes emergency measures kind of sneak in the back door, and then before we know it, they're part of our life. So I think it's incumbent upon us to actually think through and justify even the emergency measures before we end up with tanks and goose steps and boots and things I don't like in authoritarian regimes. Because I saw this with the Patriot Act, and I don't know, people start talking about emergency measures, and all of a sudden my rights start getting trampled.
Well, again, I think it's very important to recognize that when we're talking about measures that have to be taken in face of this special crisis, we're talking about measures that have as their aim, in a sense, protecting our various spheres of freedom, to maintain our family lives as associations where we can co-determine our joint welfare, as matters of upholding an economic order where we can actually have equal economic opportunity, as well as upholding a political order. And I think it's instructive to think back about what happened during our Civil War, where Lincoln managed to maintain the democratic fabric as it existed, and elections were held, even when one of the major parties, the Democratic Party, was willing, in a sense, to come to a compromise with the Confederacy, very much against everything Lincoln was fighting for. But the political process went on as before.
So so the pandemic shouldn't be an excuse to give up our political norms, but instead we could use it to enhance it and clarify who we are.
Well, I think we have to recognize that it's possible for the pandemic to disrupt in
there are many disrupting factors.
The engagement in self-government.
Oh, okay.
So at every level, voting, politicking, conventions of political parties, all of these are, in a sense, under massive threat
What?
from the precautions that need to be taken. But we have to think about ways in which we can, in a sense, adapt so that we do not nullify the process of our political self-determination. Now, the same thing applies to our lives and family and society. And again, you can take as an example the response of FDR to the Great Depression, where various measures were taken in what was up till now our greatest economic calamity, and measures were instituted which did not really involve restrictions on economic freedom, but rather measures that allowed people who had been excluded from participation in economic activity to begin working again, begin being able to enter into market relations, begin to exercise their freedom as unionized employees and the like. Now, also, you can have a response as President Obama made to what until now had been the second greatest economic emergency.
Good.
The 2008, Great Recession, where the worldwide economic order was on the point of a collapse into a genuine depression. And massive measures were taken to prop up the banking industry, the financial industry. There was a certain degree of economic stimulus. But what was not done were the introduction of permanent measures to protect us from future disasters of a similar scale.
Okay.
Nor were measures taken to really remedy the economic repercussions that ordinary people were suffering
Now we did.
in losing their homes, etc.
Now we
We
did.
need to do better this time around.
We did find some permanent measures in the aftermath of 9/11, and some would say the Patriot Act became a permanent measure, regardless of what we thought we were doing at the time. So the hesitancy towards permanent measures is not unfounded. And so how do you account for people's justified wariness concerning permanent changes in the face of these crises?
Well, I think if you look hard at what are the kind of measures that need to be taken,
Good.
they turn out to be measures that are not restrictive, but liberating.
Oh, okay.
And I think you already see this at work in other nations, which are making use of these measures, which in many cases they have already had instituted as permanent features of their social and political order. Whereas we are now thinking of things or discussing things that have not yet been implemented. And what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about such things as paid leave.
Yes.
Because after all, the coronavirus is facing many people with a prospect of, first of all, falling ill and not being at work and entering quarantine. Businesses shutting down in various ways. So many people are finding themselves, shall we say, on leave or for that matter dismissed and not having, any resources to support themselves and their families. So this is not a measure that is in any way an imposition or restriction on anyone's freedom. This is rather a way of allowing people to maintain their basic economic independence. Similar measures pertain to having access to the testing individuals need, as well as the medical care that they need. In most other developed nations, access is already provided to the extent that the resources are there. Now, of course, we're facing a huge crisis where the resources may be badly strained when there's a large outbreak. But in our country, what compounds the dilemma of most people, or many people, is on the one hand, there are millions who have no health insurance. There are millions more who have health insurance that they can't afford to use because the copays and deductibles are too high. And as a result, many people find themselves shut out from getting the care they need, which is, of course, a matter for us all, not just as people who have a conscience and are concerned with the welfare of others, but also the fact that this will allow the pandemic to spread. The same thing pertains to our undocumented population. Unless we can guarantee that they can seek medical care without having to worry about being deported, they are going to find themselves unable to get the care they need or the testing they need. And that's going to be something that is going to very much hamper our efforts to contain the spread of the coronavirus. So in all these respects, we're talking about measures, and there are more that one can speak about. Obviously, when people find themselves on leave without pay or facing layoffs because of various industries having to curtail their operations, they then find themselves without the income to be able to pay rent, pay mortgage payments, to pay utility bills. So we have to come up with remedies so that they can get through this emergency without, in a sense, being deprived of the fundamental right to a decent home.
I have a question in chat about the prohibition against gatherings.
Yeah.
They find it odious, and they're worried how permanent it's going to be.
Yeah. Well, if you look at how various countries have been handling the pandemic, some have resorted, as China has, as Italy is resorting to now, as various regions in the U.S. are doing, to drastically curtailing, let's say, social community through measures of so-called social distancing, prohibiting meetings of significant numbers of people, in effect, shutting down sports events, theater events, political gatherings, and so forth. Now, obviously, that has both vast economic repercussions, at least in the short term. It also threatens to disrupt our political process and to disrupt things in this all-important election year in this country. So I think we have to rise to the challenge of providing the resources so that our political process can go on. And there are very specific measures that we can talk about that would make that possible.
And we're gonna talk about it. So another person says, leave without pay is clearly going to affect the American descendants of slaves, black people, that's us, who are disproportionately hourly workers. So how do you address this leave without pay?
Well, frankly, all of the measures we're talking about, access to health care, access to decent housing, access to leave and decently paid jobs, all of these things are heightened difficulties for people of color who have faced historical disadvantage in various respects.
It's not as if we were doing so well before.
Yeah, and that's why if we recognize that we need to institute measures that secure these rights to a decent living and a job, rights to decent housing, rights to health care, as measures that are needed in order to curtail this pandemic. We can also recognize that they are measures that are crucial if we want to overcome intergenerational disadvantage and overcome, the stain of racial and gender disadvantage that remains entrenched in this country. And it's important to recognize that with the enforcement of each of the rights in question, although they apply to all, they will disproportionately benefit those who have been most deprived of the opportunity to exercise their rights. But this gives us a sense of how what we have to introduce here as a matter of necessity, as a matter of life and death, is also a matter of freedom and liberation, a matter of, in a sense, doing the right thing, of not just securing life, but securing a good life. And that is what we are summoned to do. And fortunately, the very pressure of events gives us an opportunity to overcome the resistance of those who have been, in a sense, defying the necessary measures and resisting them and doing everything in their power to avoid having paid leave, for example, avoid having guaranteed jobs, avoid having health care that's available to all, to avoid ensuring that people are not evicted and foreclosed or have to turn off their utilities and live either in the cold or in overbearing heat. Well, now, what is a matter of life and death now it seems to get tied with what is a matter of living a good life.
Right.
And instituting the matters that, in a sense, can also overcome all of the historically grounded disparities.
So you suggest
people in this nation and other nations. This is, after all, a worldwide challenge. And if we rise to the challenge here and abroad, we can come out of it much better than we were when this came upon us. And we have to keep in mind, it is not just a national challenge, it is an international challenge. All of the remedies we need to instituted in our own nation have to be instituted worldwide. And we, as the richest nation on the earth, with, in many respects, the greatest international clout, must use our influence to cooperate in a way that will ameliorate the situation. And this is also a matter of life and death for us.
Yes.
Because if we fail to provide the assistance that can curtail the pandemic, it's going to come back and bite us.
So you suggested before that there are going to be concrete measures. I assume one of those would be disallowing evictions during the pandemic because people are going to lose wages. What are we going to do about utility cutoffs? Are we going to force people to negotiate those or have the state step in and negotiate on their behalf?
Yeah.
How do you see some of that shaking out, and what do you see becoming permanent?
Yeah. Now, of course, there are two sides to the issue of evictions, foreclosures, utility turnoffs. There's the problem, of course, of the people who live in apartments and houses and the like, and their welfare. But of course, we also have to concern ourselves with the viability of landlords, banks that offer mortgages, utility companies, and so forth.
Right.
They have to be able to survive, but we also have to ensure that people are not losing their homes and are living in miserable situations because they can't turn on the water or electricity or whatever else, or broadband for that matter. So, we have to provide a solution that will be to the benefit of both sides. And we can do it as something that, in a way, can be thought of as just a basic part of what it means to enforce the right to decent housing.
Right.
By essentially prohibiting evictions, foreclosures, and utility turnoffs, and having mandatory repayment schedules. And if we're not right now able to provide renters and people living in houses and so forth with sufficient disposable income to pay on a sort of rescheduled basis, then the government has to step in and, at least on a temporary basis, provide what will be needed for those receiving these payments to remain solvent until we can ensure that everyone has a decent livelihood and sufficient funds to meet their housing needs.
So this abolishing of evictions and turnoffs, this would be a permanent feature of a Winfield administration if you were elected.
But of course, I think what will, in a way, make the need for public subsidies something that can greatly diminish is that, we need to ensure that anyone who wants to work and is able to work can have a job, which requires the government to step in.
Right.
When the market is failing to provide everyone who wants employment with a full-time job.
A lot of people are going to lose jobs over the next 3 or 4 months.
So we need to ensure that there is a job awaiting them, and we have to figure out what things need to be done that are not being done. And of course, we know there are plenty, and this situation itself provides many things that are going to have to be done in terms of both caring for people, tending to people while their providers are quarantined or whatever. There are many things we can talk about later as to what would be the specific measures taken.
Good.
But these are matters that are simply a matter of enforcing our rights to economic independence. And that has to be tied, of course, to people being paid a fair wage, which is not just enough to scrounge by and not starve, but enough to exercise all your freedoms and to share in the rising prosperity of the nation. And that also has tied with it, the right to have a fair share in the governance of the enterprise where one may be employed, which has on the one side enforcing the right to engage in collective bargaining through automatic elections in enterprises that are not yet unionized, elections for union representation, and having half the seats on corporate boards being filled by the elected representatives of employees. These are measures that, in a sense, are necessary for our public welfare and for the freedom of everyone. And they're not at all bad for business. They've been implemented in other nations, such as Germany, that have some of the strongest manufacturing sectors. And it's simply a matter of doing things that will also make it possible for people to afford their apartments, their homes, etc. and make the need for rescheduling of payments a thing that will be much more of a rarity than it is now. But we can see that this is a measure that will also, these kind of measures will address the current extreme situation. But by conquering the extreme situation and retaining these measures, we will all have a kind of security that will not restrict what we can do, but will enable us to have our opportunities.
So the aim is to conquer the measures in a way that clarifies our rights and what it means to be a free American or a free person in a functioning nation.
Yeah. And so, for example, this is an extreme situation where many, many people are going to be facing having to go on leave, either because they fall ill or because they're under quarantine. And others, of course, are also going to be facing layoffs. We need to ensure that they retain economic independence. They have to have paid leave.
Right.
And we have to ensure that the funds for that are available. Obviously, some businesses, particularly under the situation they're facing now, may not be able to do it. So we need to have a publicly secured system that will ensure that monies for paid leave are available. Under normal circumstances, this could be done by a kind of paid leave insurance system into which employers would have to pay. And that way they could cover themselves. And that would also be something that would prevent them from discriminating against women, because one ought to have at least 9-month paid parental leave. So we want to ensure that businesses are not going to avoid employing prospective parents because they're going to have higher costs of paid leave. We have to, in a sense, share that burden, and we can do it through this kind of public insurance system. But until we have it, our government has to step in and make use of its various financial resources to allow people to weather this storm. And it can be done. We have the resources.
Good. I have a question from the chat. Congress has the lowest approval rating and productivity in history. How are you going to collaborate to get legislation passed that matches your platform?
Well, I think things are going to have to be done before a new Congress comes into office in 2021. And I think there is going to be mounting public pressure on Congress to act because we are in an emergency and Congress has to act. And I think those in Congress who refuse to act should be seeing the writing on the wall, that this is going to affect their political chances in 2020.
Very good.
So even if in the past they've turned a cold shoulder to these measures, we already see people who have always opposed paid leave speaking about the possibility of offering it. Likewise, of perhaps preventing people from being thrown out of their living spaces. And likewise, consenting to some degree to the idea that certain medical services should be given to all without charge. And the pressures are building to move to these solutions in face of this crisis. But on the other hand, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that we need to have these on an ongoing basis. And our failure to have them has put us in greater jeopardy than those nations that do have them and properly fund them. So I think that will have a lot to say over to what degree our Congress sits on its rear end and does nothing.
Good.
And of course, we're talking in particular of the Republican contingent of both houses, and particularly the Senate. Because if they fail to act, they will have blood on their hands. And I think that will be clear to everyone.
So we're going to try to do a segment like this every day next week, actually. Every day next week. And for that to work, I'm going to need you to send me questions. So I want you to send me questions of what you would want the senator to address. And you can send that to IRAMI, that's IRAMI, at funkyacademic.com. And if you like anything that the senator is saying, or the candidate is saying, go ahead and go to winfieldforsenate.com and, check out his issues and his platforms. This is written before the pandemic, but I think that if his platform was actually installed prior to the pandemic, we would all have a much softer blow. And I'm going to let the candidate have the last word. What do you have? What's on your mind?
Now, I want to say one thing about the various strategies different countries have taken through the crisis. I think they all have recognized that one has to try to maintain the functioning of our institutions as best as possible in current circumstances. But that specific measures have to be taken now to meet this emergency. And a key part of meeting the emergency is to ensure that we're not blind. And that means that we have to provide as universal testing as possible of people. Now, Singapore has reportedly succeeded in containing the coronavirus outbreak without closing down schools, without closing down workplaces, but by instead relying upon a general, almost daily testing of people and then locating the people who are have fallen ill and those
and kicking them off the island.
And then they put them in quarantine.
I don't know. I've been to Singapore, man.
But if we don't have the testing, and we haven't had the testing in this country in a very irresponsible way, then we are stuck with having to rely upon massive measures of social isolation, hopefully on a very temporary basis until we can get the testing regime underway. But those social isolation moves really require us to immediately step to the plate in providing the kind of support individuals need to be able to care for their family members, to be able to sustain themselves economically, to maintain the place where they're living, and to get access to the healthcare they need. And that is something that will have to be done right now.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this, Dr. Winfield. And we will go on in more specificity next week. And like I said, I'm going to try to do this for a half hour every day next week. And we're going to hit the candidate about what it is to govern in the time of pandemic. Because I think
Well, thank you.
yeah, it creates particular challenges and particular crises. And I think it can make us stronger if we can figure this out. So watch with your kids, talk at home, email me at iremy@funkyacademic.com. Go to Dr. Winfield's webpage and check him out. And we will see you next week.
Can I say one last?
Yeah, sure. Go.
You know, as of the last couple of days, all of the public campaign events that had been scheduled are being canceled one after another. If we're going to continue the political debate that we have to have more than ever, we have to resort to such things as online resources. So I hope that you, the audience, will take advantage of these opportunities, because they may be the only things we can rely upon until public meetings again become permitted.
Yeah, so share this video around and tell your friends and share this to all your political groups. And look, I hit harder than Terry Gross. So you guys should watch this video as opposed to listening to NPR, because they're going to talk about doom and gloom and how bad it is. We're going to talk about solutions going to the future, and they're going to be structural. And these solutions are going to make us a stronger nation. And we're going to hit it hard every day next week. It's not going to be doom and gloom. It's going to be, how do we use this to productively govern our nation in a responsible way and secure our freedoms through the pandemic, not in spite of them, possibly because of it. But this is the life we live, and we're going to figure out how to do it responsibly. All right. Thank you for your time, and I will see you next week. I'm without intern, so this is all me. All right. And if you like anything we're doing, go ahead and go to funkyacademic.com and, kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month to support the work we're doing. We're trying to provide the political education that maybe you don't get on network television or anywhere else. Thank you, Dr. Winfield, and I will see you all, including the doc, next week.